King Tut is no doubt the most widely known pharaoh of ancient Egypt, and this is probably due to a couple of reasons. For one, his tomb was not discovered until modern times, when in 1922, excavators led by Howard Carter would unearth it more than 3,300 years after King Tut's death. Secondly, is the fact that it had not been plundered by grave robbers, and it lay largely untouched until its discovery. And this tomb was luxurious, consisting of more than 5,000 burial goods that were laid to rest with him. It created a media frenzy and brought back ancient Egyptian designs to the Western public. But there's one more reason why King Tut's tomb is so famous, or maybe I should say infamous. Along with Howard Carter was the financial backer of this whole operation, that of the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, a man named George Herbert. Herbert, who had supported the expedition for nearly 5 years, was about to pull out of the project when Carter contacted him on November 4th to let him know of the major discovery. And 3 weeks later, on November 26th, Carter and Herbert were the first people in modern times to see the tomb. But in a swift turn of events, a short 5 months later, Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, would die on April 5th. He had suffered a severe mosquito bite, which became infected after he accidentally cut himself shaving. This eventually led to blood poisoning and then pneumonia. His death would give birth to the curse of King Tut. This curse is said to be cast on anyone that disturbs a pharaoh's tomb, and does not differentiate between thieves and archaeologists. It can bring bad luck, illness, or death. But we are just getting started, because next would be George J. Gould, a wealthy railroad executive who visited the tomb shortly after the discovery. He died 1 month after George Herbert on May 16th, after he developed yellow fever. 5 years later, A.C. Mace, a member of the excavation team, died from pneumonia. The following year, Richard Bethel, Carter's secretary, died in bed, the victim of a suspected smothering. Sir Bruce Ingham, a friend of George Carter, was given a gift by him, which came from the tomb, but not long after, his house burned down, and then he was hit with a flood during the rebuild. Hugh Evelyn White, a British archaeologist who visited the tomb and may have worked during the excavation, committed suicide in 1924. Sir Archibald Reed, a radiologist who x-rayed Tut before the mummy was given to a museum, got sick the next day and died 3 days later. But this is not just a cute legend that people kinda have fun with. Since the mid-20th century, a bunch of authors and documentaries have tried to portray the curse as being real in the sense that it brings scientifically explicable causes of death, such as bacteria in the Earl's case, going as far to say that the tombs housed pathogens that were dangerous or even deadly to people with a weakened immune system, like Lord Carnarvon. Considering that some of the mummies carried mold and the tomb walls had bacteria, it was very possible that the curse is biological in nature, whereas skeptics point out that only 8 of the 58 people present during the opening of the tomb and sarcophagus died within a dozen years, and not the 26 people within 10 years that is sometimes cited. Carter himself, who led the expedition, lived almost 20 years afterwards. They claim that the real origin of the Egyptian mummy came from European cultures, and that it had no connection to a real scientific phenomenon. Furthermore, in spite of popular misconceptions, there's no inscriptions anywhere inside the pharaoh's tomb that speak of a curse. Actually, inscriptions warning of curses inside these ancient tombs are extremely rare. Chances are, if you have watched any news programming in the past decade, you have no doubt heard a pundit proclaiming the end of civilization is just around the corner. This end they are talking about is always caused by the other end of the political spectrum, and is always melodramatic and told only to rile up the viewers of the program. But what if our society really collapsed? How would this play out? Actually, we know a little bit about this for one reason, that being the Bronze Age. The Bronze Age is one of the most important times in the development of human civilization. It lasted from around 3300 BC to 1200 BC and marks the beginning of the use of bronze, which is produced by smelting copper and alloying it with tin arsenic or other metals. This was an upgrade from the Stone Age, which, obviously, used stones for everything from tools to structures. The Bronze Age is also notable because writing started popping up in some areas, as well as the early beginnings of urban civilizations. And in spite of these facts, it's not what the Bronze Age is remembered for. It's actually remembered more for its devastating collapse, which happened suddenly. It occurred in just a short 50 years between 1200 and 1150 BC. It affected northern Africa, southeastern Europe, and the Near East, particularly Egypt, Libya, the Balkans, the Aegean, Anatolia, and the Caucasus. As mentioned, it happened suddenly, but it was also violent, disruptive, and crushed the economies of many of the powers at the time. It took these rich early cities and turned them into nothing but small isolated villages. The wide-ranging trade network that had been set up, which largely moved bronze back and forth, was cut off. And not only were the trade relations cut off, but so were diplomatic relations. Writing systems vanished, and maybe most eerily, there was widespread devastation and large-scale death. This was the Dark Age before the one that would occur after the collapse of Rome. But what caused these advanced civilizations to just seemingly collapse within a span of 50 years? Well, that's the mystery. No one knows for sure, but there's multiple theories. But for the sake of simplicity, we'll break it down into 3 categories, that being invasions, internal disruptions, and climate. Let's start with the invasions, because according to this theory, the fall of the late Bronze Age can be squarely put on the shoulders of one people, a mysterious people, that of the Sea People, which we covered in an earlier mystery Iceberg. These nomadic tribes of invaders most likely came from somewhere in southern Europe, Asia Minor, or even the Mediterranean islands. Historians don't have a great idea who they all were or where they came from. There's very little evidence outside 7 ancient Egyptian texts, but they have always been thought as the main reason for the sole collapse of the Bronze Age. And if we go back to the bronze trading system, in which basically every civilization relied heavily on trade, the main thing was that bronze required copper and tin for production. For some peoples, like the Mycenaeans, this meant they would import tin from England, Spain, or Afghanistan while getting their copper from Cyprus. Depending on where you was in the trading circle, affected where you got your goods. But the key thing in this is, this trade network was very vulnerable. Once it was invaded or collapsed in one area, then the rest of the societies would also begin to collapse. So if the invasion theory is right, that means the Sea Peoples, who are theorized to have sailed around the eastern Mediterranean and raided Anatolia, Syria, Phoenicia, Canaan, Cyprus, and Egypt in particular, were so disruptive that collapsing one or more of these trade nodes in the network caused the rest of the societies linked to them to collapse as well. Another angle in this invasion theory might be that a group of people called the Dorians, according to the Dorian invasion theory, the Dorians, who are just as mysterious as the Sea Peoples, came from a place that is yet to be identified, but was probably somewhere in the mountainous regions of Greece, and invaded and replaced the dialects and traditions in southern Greece. They're mostly known for their isolationist military state of Sparta. It's thought that their invasion brought down basically every civilization in Greece, which then had a cascading effect on the rest of the known world. However, some historians group the Dorians with the Sea Peoples, whereas some people claim that the Dorians came after the Bronze Age collapse altogether. The second theory we listed as internal disruptions. This one is particularly caused by the aforementioned invasions. These invasions, which put a strain on trade, would then in turn put a strain on the other societies. It could also lead to famines and political instability, which then leads to rebellions. This one was only made worse because a kingdom may be at the point of collapse, and then a large portion of their population migrates to a neighboring kingdom, which then puts a strain on their resources, especially food. This is further backed up by the tomb robbing during this time period, in which the main thing stolen was food. In fact, in recent years, the Sea Peoples have been seen more as a symptom of a severe famine and not the cause. This is kind of validated by the depictions of the Sea Peoples in Egypt, in which it shows ox carts with them, indicating the Sea Peoples may have been refugees. Finally is the uptick in ironworking, which led to less of a demand for bronze, which again caused economic disruptions. The last theory was the all-encompassing climate and/or climate change. A theory that has gained momentum in recent years is that abrupt temperature shifts during this time frame led to crop failures on an unprecedented scale, leading to a crisis. Among these temperature shifts came droughts, which also could have caused famine, and famine leads to civil unrest. A 2023 study of tree rings in the region showed 3 consecutive years of drought between 1198 and 1196, and with the increase in surface temperature brings along the spread of diseases, which could have led to a pandemic. And this doesn't even take into account a series of earthquakes that hit in rapid succession, which led to widespread destruction and again, the decline of trade. And since this was a society who lived by candlelight, the earthquakes could have knocked these over, leading to many highly flammable wooden buildings burning down. However, in recent years, earthquakes as a cause has been played down. Volcanoes are another climate one, particularly that of an eruption in Iceland in 1159 BC, which is thought to have led to famines in the time period, and is even thought to have caused a volcanic winter. So as you can see, there's many theories. Some historians believe that not one factor caused it, and that it was all these things happening at once that caused the decline of the Bronze Age. All in all, it was not a good time to be around. You have probably heard the name, Grigory Rasputin, the man who would be nicknamed the Mad Monk. But this Mad Monk, who would find himself in the Russian Tsar's inner circle in the early 20th century, came up from humble origins. Born in 1869 in a small village in Siberia, Rasputin grew up with a relatively normal life, despite having a few run-ins with local authorities. He would do like most, marry and have a few children, but his life changed in 1892 after joining a monastery for a few months. But unlike other men who joined the monastery, Rasputin never gave up his past life or family, and he never took any holy orders, thus was not a real monk, contrary to his nickname. However, because of his religious zeal and his captivating charisma, he soon got the attention of some Russian Orthodox clergymen, which then led to him being discovered by some senior members of the imperial family, that of Nicholas II and his wife Alexandra. The king and his wife were so impressed that he would later tell one of his ministers that what should have been a 5-minute conversation with Rasputin went on for more than an hour. The imperial couple were not strangers to meeting with the more unusual type of spiritual advisors at times in the past. So Rasputin would really step in and fill this need the two had for meeting with a mystic, or some may say, charlatan. And that's because he was really just good at reading what they wanted to hear, and then telling them that exact thing. For example, encouraging Nicholas to be more confident in his role as Tsar. He was also said to meet with Alexandra and soothed her anxieties, which would later fuel rumors the two were having an affair, which there was no real evidence of. But he quickly became a mainstay in the royal palace, and by World War I, he was given political advice and making suggestions for government-appointed officials. And as you can imagine, this didn't go over well with the elite, who wanted the strange con man out of the royal family's sight. But that would not happen soon, because the one thing Rasputin done that really won favor with Nicholas and Alexandra was he allegedly helped alleviate their only son Alexei's hemophilia, which is of course a rare bleeding disorder in which your blood does not clot properly. It can cause you to bleed out from injuries, or just lead to spontaneous bleeding. And just how Rasputin was really able to help this kid is still debated today. But we know from records that Rasputin would kneel at the foot of the young boy's bed and pray, and it's thought that maybe this calmed down the mood in the palace, which assisted in his recovery. In the 2016 book, Rasputin, Faith, Power, and the Twilight of the Romanovs, it was speculated that Rasputin's assurances calmed Alexandra and gave her confidence, and she in turn transferred this confidence to her ailing son. Others from the royal palace would record that they thought Rasputin used folk medicine he had learned growing up in the Siberian villages, which was used to treat internal bleeding in horses. Another wise move by Rasputin was his insistence that doctors stay away and not treat Alexei. And this was a good thing, because at the time, aspirin, which was only about 2 decades old, was used as a cure-all drug, and doctors threw them out like candy. And of course, someone with a bleeding disorder would be severely compromised by taking aspirin, which no one knew at the time that aspirin thinned the blood. In fact, Rasputin had the royal family throw all the medicine into the fire, and of course, Alexei appeared to improve. And while this was going on, he was presenting himself as a holy man, yet he had no affiliation with the church. He also spoke as a self-appointed representative of the peasantry, pretending to be this man with a lot of humility, when in reality, he was a drunk, and had affairs with numerous women, from sex workers to some of the highest women in society. He loved his new fame, and even started showing off by wearing shirts personally embroidered for him by the Empress. He would even take her servants and friends back to his place, and I assume that it wasn't for prayer. His wife was just as starstruck, commenting that he had enough for all the women. Unfortunately for the royal family, the press, which had just gotten real journalist freedoms about a decade earlier, would write all kinds of sensational stories about Rasputin. The stories then began to spread throughout Europe. Petitioners would even mail requests to Rasputin to the palace, thinking he lived there. And it's here, in the middle of the First World War, these rumors I mentioned earlier would begin. Soldiers on the Eastern Front spoke of Rasputin and Alexandra having an affair that was supposedly common knowledge. Then rumors would begin he was working with Germany to defeat Russia in the war. Or, the even crazier one, he started a cholera epidemic in St. Petersburg with poisoned apples imported from Canada, because that's how Canadians roll. This in turn only fueled demands by the elite to get rid of him, which is where a young man named Felix Yusupov comes into the picture. He grew up in one of the wealthiest families in Russia, lived a life of privilege, and would even marry the king's niece. Yet he was described as aimless, or maybe kinda lost, like he needed a direction in life, and that ultimately led to him plotting to kill Rasputin. That way, he could become what he thought was a patriot defending the throne. And he also thought with Rasputin gone, the king would have to trust the advice of his extended family more, which may lead to him getting a prestigious position. That's when we come to the second part of this mystery, because not only is Rasputin's life an enigma, but his death is even more confounding. Felix would record in his memoirs that he invited Rasputin to the palace under the guise of introducing him to his wife, where he would then serve him cakes and wine laced with potassium cyanide, to which Rasputin devoured. And instead of falling over as you would expect, Rasputin was unaffected by the poison. Felix, dumbfounded, would go to get a gun and would shoot Rasputin multiple times, yet he still did not die. So they beat him and took him to throw him in an icy river, where he was found several days later. This only caused the aura of mysticism around Rasputin to grow even more. But is it true? Well, it was coming from Felix, who seemed desperate for attention, and according to Rasputin's daughter Maria, it wasn't true. She downright said Felix's account was a lie, because she claimed her father didn't even like sweets. Furthermore, the real autopsy contradicted Felix's claims, because there was no poison found in his body, nor was there any water in his lungs. Instead, he died from a gunshot wound to the head. She would claim Felix made up the story to enhance his reputation. However, there are many conflicting accounts, with some still believing that Felix's account was accurate and Rasputin miraculously survived multiple gunshots as well as poisoning, only to drown afterwards. One investigation even found evidence, such as a brown boot retrieved from the frozen water and blood on the bridge railings from where Rasputin was said to have been thrown from. The records we have from the Dark Ages are notoriously spotty for the time period, thus leading to the name Dark Ages. However, some records that have survived the sands of time offer incredible stories, and that's what we're going to take a look at here, because according to 4 different accounts, between the years 891 and 906 AD, the body of a drowned giant woman would be found on the shores of Scotland. First we go to the Annals of Ulster in 891, which were compiled by a scribe. He would state, "The sea threw up a woman in Scotland. She was 195 feet in height. Her hair was 17 feet long, and the finger on her hand was 7 feet long, while her nose was 7 feet. Her body was also stated to be as white as a swan." This would be followed by the Annals of the Four Masters the same year, which was compiled by several authors and recorded the chronicles of medieval Irish history. The account was basically the same as the first one, except her hair was recorded to be 18 feet instead of 17 feet. Then we move forward 9 years to 900 AD with Chronicon Scotorum, which is copied from the Annals of Tigernach, another chronicle of Ireland, which recorded a great woman was cast ashore by the sea in Scotland. Her length is 192 feet. The length of her hair was 15 feet, and the length of her finger was 6 feet, and her nose 7 feet, with her body being once again described as white as a swan. Curiously, in this record, it states the area between her breasts measured 6 feet, which I imagine made it difficult to motorboat. Then we move forward 6 years to 906 AD in the Annals of Innisfallen, written by Irish monks who would record a giant woman washed ashore. This time, she measured 192 feet, while her hair was again 16 feet, and her fingers 6 feet, and nose 6 feet, with skin the color of a swan or sea foam. So even though the descriptions of a beautiful giant woman sounds like something I would have written at 13 years old, these were legit scholars at the time recording this, which is weird enough, but the really interesting part about all this is the almost formulaic repetition of the details. The measurements are basically the same, only altered by a foot or two, and you may think, so what, big deal. But this was a period of 15 years in the Dark Ages. These scribes most likely never met, yet somehow still heard the exact same details of these stories, which is what makes it weird. Is it possible the later scribes read the first account and just copied it? Possibly. Or could it be a superstition, or maybe even a story that came from one of the old pagan religions? Or is it possible that a beautiful giant woman washed ashore? Lizzie Borden is a name you have all heard before, known especially from the childhood folk rhyme, which mentions taking an axe and giving 40 whacks. But what actually happened on August 4th, 1892, and why did it occur? For that, we have to go back a bit. Lizzie grew up in Fall River, Massachusetts, in a wealthy family in an affluent neighborhood. Her mom died in 1863, just 3 years after Lizzie was born, and her father, Andrew Borden, would remarry just 3 years after her death to a woman named Abby Gray. As Lizzie grew up, the relationship between her and her stepmother was strained, to say the least, as she believed Abby had married her father only for his wealth, and it seems like the whole family dynamics were not really good. A live-in maid would later testify that Lizzie and her sister Emma rarely ate meals with their father and stepmother. And if we move further ahead to 1892, there is a story of Andrew killing multiple pigeons with a hatchet because local children were hanging around hunting them, which allegedly upset Lizzie, who had recently just built a roost for the pigeons. However, this whole story is disputed. What is known is a family argument happened that July that prompted both sisters to take extended vacations to New Bedford. The girls would return late that July, with Lizzie choosing to stay in a rooming house for 4 days before finally returning home. But tensions remained high. Andrew had been gifting out real estate to various people in Abby's family. Finally, after Abby's sister received a house, the sisters demanded rental property, which was then given to them. It was actually the home they had lived in until their mother died. He sold it to them for $1, but they would turn around a few weeks later and resell the property for $5,000, or about $170,000 in today's money. Then, John Morse, Lizzie's uncle, visited and stayed for a few days to discuss business matters with Andrew, which has always been speculated that it was about a property transfer, which could have made the already tense situation worse. John slept in the guest room, and the next morning, Andrew, Abby, John, and the maid went to the sitting room and chat. John then left to town, intending to return at lunch. Andrew then left at 9 a.m. to go for a walk. Abby then went upstairs between 9 and 10:30 a.m. to make the bed. Somewhere in that time frame, she would be struck on the side of the head with a hatchet just above her ear, causing her to turn and fall face down on the floor, causing bruising to her nose and forehead. It was here the killer then struck her multiple times, delving 17 more blows to the back of the head, killing her. Later investigations would show she had been attacked while facing the killer. Andrew returned from his work around 10:30 a.m., and his key did not appear to work on the door, so he knocked. The maid would then go unlock it, to find it jammed, leading her to drop a cuss word, and it's here the maid, Bridget Sullivan, would hear Lizzie laughing. Although she did not see her, she thought it was coming from the top of the stairs, which would be a big deal considering that Abby was already dead and visible to anyone standing on the second floor. Although Lizzie denied being upstairs and stated that Andrew had asked where she was and Lizzie had replied that a messenger had delivered Abby a summons to visit a sick friend. The maid would then remove Andrew's boots and helped him into slippers before he lay down on the sofa for a nap, which contradicts the photos where he was wearing boots. She then went down to her third-floor room before Lizzie at 11:10 a.m. called for her. "Maggie, come quick. Father's dead. Somebody came in and killed him." She rushed up to see Andrew slumped on the couch in the downstairs sitting room, struck 10 or 11 times with a hatchet-like weapon. One of his eyes had been split cleanly in two, suggesting he was attacked while he slept. His wounds were also still bleeding, indicating it was a very recent attack. The family physician would arrive shortly to pronounce both victims dead, with Andrew's death being estimated at 11. The investigation began, and Lizzie told detectives she heard a groan or scraping noise, or maybe even a distress call before walking in. 2 hours later, she stated she had heard nothing and walked in the home, not realizing anything was wrong. When asked about where her stepmother was, Abby would also tell the same story about her getting a note to go visit a sick friend. She also stated she thought Abby had returned and asked someone to go upstairs to look for her. A neighbor would then walk halfway up to find Abby lying face down on the floor. Officers who interviewed Lizzie reportedly did not like her attitude, as she seemed calm and poised. She also changed alibis. Police, however, still did not check her for blood. They did do a cursory search in her room, but later admitted it wasn't proper cause Lizzie said she wasn't feeling good. 2 hatchets, 2 axes, and a hatchet head with a broken handle were found downstairs. The hatchet head was suspected of being the murder weapon, as the break in the handle appeared fresh, as well as the dust and ash on the head, which appeared to have been deliberately applied to make it look like it had been laying in the basement a while. Now, one thing we didn't mention, the family had been sick for days leading up to these murders, so because of this mysterious illness, the victims' stomachs were tested for poison, but none was found, although supposedly Lizzie had asked a local druggist about cyanide in a diluted form, but her defense was she was looking for something to clean her furs, despite the medical examiner stating it did not have antiseptic properties. Now at this time, a woman named Alice Russell entered the picture. She was Lizzie's friend and decided to spend the night with the sisters the night after the murders. Police were stationed around the house to watch, and at one point during the night, one officer spotted Lizzie and Alice with a kerosene lamp and a slop pail. He saw both women leaving the cellar, after which Lizzie returned alone, but he was not able to see what she was doing, but she was bent over a sink. John Morse, the uncle, finally left the home the next day and had to be escorted out by police. The next morning, Alice would find Lizzie tearing up a dress and putting it on a fire because she claimed it was covered in paint. It's never been determined if that was the dress wore on the day of the murders or not. Lizzie would appear at the inquest, where her testimony and behavior was erratic. Sometimes she refused to answer a question, even if it would have benefited her. She gave contradictory stories and different accounts, such as saying that she was in the kitchen reading a magazine when her father arrived home, then saying she was in the dining room doing some ironing, then saying she had just came downstairs. The testimony was later blamed on the morphine she had taken to calm her nerves. The trial began the following year, and it got huge press coverage. The focal point seemed to be that hatchet head found in the basement, as the prosecution could just never prove that it was the weapon. There was also no bloody clothing. Of course, that might have been because the dress was burned up in the fire. There was also the issue of just where was Lizzie during the murders. The maid says she left Lizzie and her father around 10:58 a.m., while Lizzie stated she left after this and went to the barn for 20 minutes to half an hour. And at least one witness stated seeing her leaving the barn at 11:03 a.m., and at 11:10 a.m. would be when Lizzie called for the maid. The judge would also strike down the incident of Lizzie attempting to buy cyanide as being too remote to connect to the case, and with that, it only took an hour and a half for the jury to acquit Lizzie Borden of the murders. So if not Lizzie, then who? There are a few other theories, such as John Morse, Lizzie's uncle and Andrew's former brother-in-law. He apparently rarely ever spoke to the family after his sister died, but for some strange reason, he just happened to spend the night before the murders. Detectives also noted he had provided an absurdly perfect and over-detailed alibi and was considered a suspect for a period. Another theory was a man named William Borden, who was suspected of being Andrew's illegitimate son. and that he was extorting money from Andrew to keep the secret hushed. However, it was proven later on that he was not Andrew's son. Another thought was that Emma, Lizzie's sister, was responsible, although she had an alibi being 15 miles away. Some believe she secretly returned to the residence to kill the two before returning back to Fairhaven to receive the telegram informing her of the murders. Others postulated that it was just a random intruder that did it for any number of reasons. Others suspected Bridget, the maid. She had been asked to wash all the windows, one of the biggest and hardest household tasks, while still suffering from food poisoning on a blisteringly hot day, and maybe that had driven her over the edge. Or maybe it was Andrew's constant penny pinching. But even if Bridget did do it, many suggest Lizzie knew and just kept quiet about it, being in no great state of upset over the deaths of two people she despised. But who are we kidding? It was almost certainly Lizzie, and the theories as to why were pretty strange. Some say she was in dissociative fugue, which is a rare psychological condition characterized as temporary amnesia and wandering behavior. The person may suddenly travel away from their environment, forget their identity, history, and everything about them, and then assume a whole new identity. Others claimed she had been abused by her father, which caused her to finally snap. However, incest was a topic that would have never been openly discussed, and taking the fact that the evidence collection basically didn't exist then, it couldn't be proven. However, the local papers did heavily imply this was the case. Another theory was that Lizzie was having a romantic rendezvous with her lover, Bridget, the maid. When Abby walked in and caught them and was horrified, Lizzie reacted by killing Abby with a candlestick. She then confessed to her father when he returned home, but he reacted the same as Abby had. So in a rage, she would kill Andrew with a hatchet while Bridget disposed of the hatchet afterwards. And this one might not be that far-fetched, because in Lizzie's later years, it was heavily rumored that Lizzie, who lived alone, was a lesbian. However, Bridget would end up marrying a man later on and moved away. Allegedly on her deathbed, she gave a confession in which she stated she changed her testimony in order to protect Lizzie. Jesus is a man who needs no introduction. You all know the story about his birth as well as his death. After being crucified, Jesus was taken to a tomb for 3 days before he rose, and that's where this mystery comes in. The location of that tomb is still unknown. Many locations have been suggested and still remain popular sites of pilgrimage, but it has never been decided exactly where he was buried. But we'll start with the top theory first. That is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in the Christian quarter of the old city of Jerusalem. Emperor Constantine in the 4th century ordered a search for Jesus' tomb, leading to the identification of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The churches since then has always recognized this as the location. It's here which the two holiest sites in Christianity, the site where Jesus was crucified, a place known as Calvary, and Jesus' empty tomb, where he is believed to have been buried and resurrected, are located. But what about the other lesser-known locations? The Garden Tomb is another one, which is a rock-cut tomb in Jerusalem that was found in 1867 and is also considered to be the tomb of Jesus. It's been dated as going far back as the 8th or 7th century BC, however. Another is the Talpiot Tomb, which was discovered in 1980 in East Talpiot neighborhood, 3 miles south of the old city in East Jerusalem. It was found with 10 ossuaries, which are boxes with skeletal remains. 6 of these boxes had inscriptions, one which has been interpreted as Yeshua bar Yehoseph, or Jeshua, son of Joseph, but the inscription is partly illegible and its translation is disputed. It's widely believed by scholars that this Jesus, if that is his name, is not the Jesus of Nazareth, since he had a son named Judas, as well as the tomb showed signs of belonging to a wealthy Judean family. Then we get a little bit more out there. The Rosa Bao is a shrine located in Srinagar, an Indian city. It translates to tomb place, and locals believe a wise man is buried here named Yusuf, and according to a man named Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, known as the leader of the Ahmadiyya movement within Islam, the man in this tomb was actually Jesus. Another place is Mount Cardu René le Chateau, which is located in southern France. This hilltop village has been the focus of several wild claims, such as being the home of the Ark of the Covenant, or the treasures of the Knights Templar, or Holy Grail, and of course, Jesus' tomb, but it's widely seen as pseudo-history. Another is the Shugborough inscription, which is located in Staffordshire, England, and we have discussed it before. It's one of the top uncracked ciphertexts, but even crazier is the claim that it's actually a village in Japan called Shingo. Here, there is a spot called Kiristo no Haka, which translates to Tomb of Jesus, and it's at this location that Jesus, along with Jesus' last descendants, the family of Sujiro Sawaguchi, lie. According to the family, Jesus did not die on the cross at Calvary, but instead, his brother Iskari took his place on the cross, while Jesus fled across Siberia and into northern Japan, where he then changed his name to Torai Tora Detenku, became a rice farmer, married a 20-year-old Japanese woman named Miyuko, and raised 3 daughters in what is now Shingo. While in Japan, it is asserted he traveled, learned, and eventually died at the age of 106, where his body was exposed on a hilltop for 4 years. According to the customs at the time, his bones were collected, bundled, and buried in the mound, which is now said to be the grave of Jesus Christ. Cinema mysteries is one we haven't touched on much, and crazily enough, one of the biggest mysteries in film took place off-screen, and that is the sad story of Louis Le Prince, which we all know the name Thomas Edison, the man widely credited for inventing the equipment which made moving images possible. Louis Le Prince actually preceded him by a good number of years with a working model that actually captured the first motion outside of his house in Roundhay, Leeds, in England. However, Le Prince would not become widely recognized for this feat because, well, he disappeared after boarding a train in September 1890 as he was preparing for a trip to the US to publicly premiere his work and join his wife and children. Before that, though, he went to visit his brother in France. On the 16th, he took a train to Paris, but having taken it later than he planned, he missed a planned meeting with his friends at Paris and never seen them again. His brother would record he boarded the train and waved goodbye. In fact, the last confirmed sighting of him was by his brother at the train station. Scotland Yard, along with the French police, conducted massive searches for him, but nothing ever came up, and since then, various theories have been proposed. One of these we touched on in the obscure conspiracy series I did a long time ago that speculates he was murdered at the behest of Thomas Edison before he could patent his camera. Le Prince's family suspected Edison right from the start. In fact, in 2008, a researcher going through the New York Library archives would come across some interesting notes left from Edison that read, "Eric called me today from Dijon. It has been done. Prince is no more. This is good news, but I flinched when he told me. Murder is not my thing. I'm an inventor, and my inventions for moving images can now move forward." This is a pretty damning note, if real. And according to the researcher, Alexis Bedford, he would take the note to a historian named Robert Meyer, who after weeks of examining the journal, confirmed its authenticity, which included the penmanship of Edison's other known writings. However, it's still not a full confession. Another theory was that Le Prince voluntarily left due to financial reasons and familial conveniences, which basically assert that Le Prince was really a gay man, and his family basically requested him to go away. So he moved to Chicago, where he lived out his life until he died in 1898. However, there's not one shred of evidence that Le Prince was gay. Another theory was that he was murdered by his brother. This is based on the fact that if Le Prince had wanted to disappear, he had many opportunities to do so before the train ride, so he most likely never boarded the train, which then leads to a more suspicious thought. If his brother was the last person to see him and knew he was suicidal, why didn't he report that to the police before it was too late? Finally, we have the thought that Le Prince did in fact commit suicide. In 2003, during research of the police archives, a photograph of a drowned man pulled from the scene in 1890 strongly resembled Le Prince. This led to the theory that he failed to get his moving picture to work, had heavy debts, and chose to take his own life. But in spite of drowning, there were marks that looked like he had taken a beating. which again ties back to the murder theory that states Edison was responsible, or that Le Prince just had ran into a group of thieves and was mugged. Others cite a late night cab ride he took, where it's alleged a cab driver took him to where two acquaintances were waiting to rob him, and there were at least 12 articles from the time period that documented this type of crime taking place. However, going against this was some have claimed the body found in the river was too short to be Le Prince. Others point to the less believable ones, such as the Le Prince family curse, or that he joined the Foreign Legion to save his family from disgrace of bankruptcy. The Mary Celeste was an American merchant ship found adrift in the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of the Azores on December 4th, 1872. The captain and crew were all missing. However, the ship was still seaworthy and the provisions were still good, and the load of alcohol they were transporting was still in the hull. The ship's captain was a man named Benjamin Briggs, and he had a high standing in the profession. He also picked a very experienced and talented crew. They left port on November 7th, just as a Canadian ship De Gratia was in nearby Hoboken, New Jersey, awaiting a cargo of petroleum. This ship was captained by Davy Morehouse and would leave port 8 days after the Mary Celeste on the 15th. By December 4th, Captain Morehouse was made aware of a vessel about 6 miles away heading towards them. The ship was moving erratically and the sails didn't look right. Morehouse suspected something was wrong, so they pulled closer. They would note that they saw nobody on deck and no one replied to their signals. The two men would be deployed in a smaller boat to investigate, and it was here they realized it was the Mary Celeste. They would climb aboard and found the rigging was damaged and ropes hung loosely over the sides. The sails were partially set and in poor condition, and some were missing. The ship's lifeboat was also missing. There was a little bit of water in the hold, but definitely not an alarming amount. They found the ship's log, and it revealed the last entry had came 9 days earlier. They also noted the ship's papers, along with the captain's navigational instruments, were missing. There were no signs of fire or violence, and it seemed like an orderly departure occurred. Captain Morehouse would decide to bring the ship to Gibraltar, as he would be awarded a substantial share for the salvage. Investigations would happen soon, and well, there were many theories. The early inspection ruled out any weather event, citing a vial of sewing machine oil found upright in place. There were also a couple of stains found that they thought might be blood, particularly one railing that had bore a deep mark possibly caused by an axe, as well as some staining on the captain's sword. The going theory was that the men of the crew got into a drunken frenzy and killed the captain and first mate, and then made the ship look like it had been in a collision before fleeing in the lifeboat. He also thought that Morehouse and his crew were hiding something. However, this fell apart when it was determined the stains found on the sword and ship were not blood, and ever since then, well, opinions vary. It's probably not something like insurance fraud, just for the fact that Briggs left his son Arthur behind, and it's hard to imagine he would have done that if he planned to disappear permanently. Pirates have been bandied about, but why didn't they steal the cargo? The main theory today is the men got off the ship due to some type of emergency and tethered a rope from the ship to the lifeboat. The rope then either broke or came undone, leaving the men to drift aimlessly. There's even some conjecture that the men were afraid the ship's cargo of alcohol was about to explode, or perhaps a candle fell and with the fumes caused a fireball that frightened the sailors but done no damage to the ship. But this overlooks the obvious. Why would you tie yourself to a ship that might explode or sink? Furthermore, Captain Briggs was experienced and probably wouldn't do that, as he would know a ship with some damage was still safer than a lifeboat. Other things like underwater earthquakes have also been proposed, as well as the crew running aground and getting onto the lifeboat only to have the ship be blown back out to sea. In 1820, New York City, the Rogers family would give birth to a little girl they would name Mary Cecilia Rogers. This girl would grow up in circumstances that left much to be desired, because her father had passed away when she was only 5, putting her mom in a bad situation, although some sources say he did not die until she was 17. Regardless, Her mom would eventually begin to make money by conducting a boarding and lodging house where the young Mary would help her mother after she grew older. And Mary, she would turn into quite the beautiful young woman. She was rather tall, had a beautiful complexion, and gorgeous jet black hair. She also had a pleasing manner that unsurprisingly led to a ton of admirers. She seemed to attract attention wherever she went, and this fact did not escape one creative entrepreneur named John Anderson. He conducted a large retail cigar store on Broadway, and after hearing of her marvelous beauty, came up with an idea to employ her as both a clerk and as an attraction. The year was now 1840, and Mary was 20, and John would travel over to pitch his idea to the young woman. And considering Mary had never worked away from home before, her mom was pretty reluctant to permit her to accept the position, as she knew that some of the young men who frequented John's cigar store were not the most upstanding young men around. But John had offered Mary quite a bit of money for those days, and she finally talked her mother into letting her accept the position. And long story short, John's predictions were spot on. As his store was now flooded with customers, Mary was always polite and modest and smiled, but she was not adverse to turning down passes from men. She would continue working the store for 10 months, until late January 1841, when she did not show up for work. John had no idea where she was, and Mary's mother became frantic. She did not waste any time going to the authorities, and this led to the press getting a hold of the story, and soon everyone was talking about the missing famous cigar girl. But this story may not end how you think, because 6 days later, Mary suddenly returned to the store. She was in good health, uninjured, but the girl who had once continually smiled now appeared to be sad and devoid of emotion. And for anyone who asked her where she had been, her answer was the same. She had visited relatives in the country. This would be the same answer her mother and John would give, but it was also obvious that Mary, her mom, and John were hiding something. This whole thing was weird, because at first, her mother reported to have found a suicide note, while the newspapers would eventually write the whole thing off as a hoax, stating that Mary had went to visit her friend in Brooklyn, and many accused John of staging the whole thing to drive up revenue for his tobacco shop. But days later, a rumor began to swirl. It was said that Mary had been seen with a tall, handsome naval officer during the time she was supposed to be in the country. These rumors would eventually get back to her about a week after she returned, and she immediately resigned from the cigar shop and went back to her mother's home. It was here that, strangely a month later, it was announced that Mary was engaged to be married to a man named Daniel Payne, a young clerk who resided in her mother's lodging house. And from here, this strange story only gets more bizarre, because at 10 a.m. on July 25th, Mary would knock on the door of her fiancé and inform him she was going to spend the day with her aunt, to which he replied, "All right, I'll call for you tonight." Then Daniel would spend the rest of the day from home, but instead of calling for her, he instead went home alone. This was due to one fact. It had came a furious thunderstorm that evening, and the rain came down in buckets. Daniel assumed there was no way she would want to walk home in this vicious storm. He would even stop and talk to her mother and explain the situation, and her mother thanked him for not bringing her home in those conditions. But the next day, the storm would subside, and Mary still had not came home. Her mother assumed she would return at some point that day, but as the hours dragged on, she became alarmed. As Daniel made it home that evening for dinner, her mother would inform him that Mary had still not arrived. Now Daniel was alarmed, and he didn't even wait for the meal to get finished. He turned right around and headed toward Mary's aunt, where she was supposed to be. But to his fright, he learned Mary had never been there at all. He would return to tell his future mother-in-law this, who of course remembered several months ago when Mary disappeared. But this time, Mary had wore very light clothing. It did not seem reasonable she could have remained away after the storm let up, but her disappearance would be reported again, and this time it caused a greater media sensation than the first time. For several days, there was no trace to be found, but sadly, before long, fishermen setting their nets would find her terribly mutilated body floating near the shore. Her face had been beaten to a pulp and was terribly swollen. Around her waist was a fastened cord. To the other end was tied a heavy stone. Her neck was tied with a piece of lace torn from her dress, tight enough to have strangled her. On her wrist were the marking of cords that had sunken deeply into her flesh. Light kid gloves were found on her hands, and her bonnet hung by its ribbons around her neck. Her clothing was badly torn, and the coroner suggested she had been killed by more than 2 or 3 persons, and she had been brutally violated. Her fiancé Daniel was interrogated immediately, but his alibi was good, and he was dismissed. A week went by, and there was absolutely no traction whatsoever. The police began to take a beating in the papers. Authorities were left with no other choice but to announce a large reward for a tip leading to the arrest and conviction. In addition, the authorities promised complete immunity to anyone having guilty knowledge of the crime, other than the killer himself. I assume this means someone who helped in destroying evidence or something like that. The next day, detectives got their first break. The coroner received an anonymous letter from someone who claimed to have seen Mary on Sunday in Hoboken, but had not came forward because of what he termed motives of perhaps criminal prudence, which I'm not sure what that means. He claimed he had seen her and 6 rough-looking men bringing a boat onto shore. He remembered because of how odd that a girl of Mary's beauty was in the company of these thugs, but she had went willingly, as he noted her laughter as they came ashore. All of them would get out on the beach and walk into the woods. It wasn't long after that a second boat was spotted. This time, 3 handsomely dressed men were rapidly pulling the boat across the river. One of them jumped ashore and met with 2 other men who were sitting on the beach. He excitedly asked them if they had seen a young woman and 6 men from a boat a few minutes before. The man said yes and pointed to the direction he seen them going. He asked the man then if he witnessed any violence being used towards the girl. He said no, she had went with them willingly. The other men made no comment, went back to his boat, got in, and left back across the other side to New York. The writer of this account was never discovered, but the letter was printed in the newspapers, and the 2 men that had been sitting on the beach that were approached and questioned did come forward and confirmed the whole story. They both knew Mary in passing, and said the woman who entered the forest with the 6 men did resemble her, but it was at such a distance they could not be 100% sure. It would be several weeks after this that the next tip came in, when a stagecoach driver named Adams stated that on that fatal Sunday, he had seen Mary arrive in Hoboken at the Bull's Ferry, accompanied by a tall, well-dressed man of dark complexion, and went with him to a roadhouse nearby. Detectives would go to this roadhouse, and the keeper, Mrs. Loss, remembered the man had came in with the young woman that day, and after drinks, they went into the adjoining woods. Soon after this, she heard a woman's screams coming from there, but since the place was already well known to be a place where questionable characters came in, and since such screams like that were a frequent occurrence, she gave it no thought. However, Mrs. Loss would later contradict this by stating that she had came in with a gang of men. It would be the children of Mrs. Loss, however, that would actually find the spot where the assault and murder had taken place, when 2 months afterwards, while playing in the woods, they found a petticoat, scarf, umbrella, and handkerchief marked with the initials Elmar. The scene showed a terrific struggle had taken place, and a broad track that seemed to have been made by a body was seen going through the bushes towards the river. The items found were conclusively identified as Mary's. For what it's worth, Mrs. Loss would give a deathbed confession stating that Mary died from a failed abortion attempt, which goes against everything the coroner found. This tall, dark-complexioned man fit the same description of the naval officer Mary had disappeared with before. A massive search for him began, but he was never found. It was believed at the time that Mary's mother knew way more about that man than she chose to tell. Daniel never recovered and committed suicide near where his fiance's body was found. The mystery would be immortalized in a short story called The Mystery of Marie Roget, which Edgar Allan Poe based the story on. It was the first murder mystery ever based on the details of a real crime. As far as theories go, of course, the tall, dark-complected man was obviously suspected. But what about her being sided with the gang? Was this his gang? Did they help in the cover-up? What about the guy who rushed ashore looking for her? Could that have been Daniel? Why didn't he speak up? Some actually point out the Daniel suicide note suggested his possible involvement with the murder. Others suggest her boss John could have been responsible, or her former fiancé, Alfred Crommelin, who was also in the area at the time and was the one who would eventually identify her body. September 1726, the strangest news one could ever imagine, would make its way to the court of King George I, told of a 25-year-old woman living in the small town of Godalming, Surrey, named Mary Toft, who, according to reports, had given birth to several rabbits. Yes, you heard that right, rabbits. Mary was an illiterate servant married to a man who sold clothing named Joshua Toft. Despite the two having just suffered a miscarriage the previous month in August, Mary had gotten pregnant again just a month later, and by the 27th of September, went into labor. Her neighbor Mary Gill and mother-in-law Ann Toft would attend to help her, so they must have been stunned right off the bat to see Mary give birth to something resembling a liverless cat. The family, horrified, would call on the help of an obstetrician named John Howard, who made it to the Toft home the next day, where he would be presented with more animal parts, which the mother-in-law Anne had taken from Mary during the night. Howard, I can only imagine, was confused, but probably smelled a hoax. He left and returned the following day, where this time he would help deliver yet more animal parts. Over the next day, John Howard would record that he had procured a rabbit's head, the legs of a cat, and in a single day, 9 dead baby rabbits. Dr. Howard would send letters to some of England's greatest doctors and scientists, along with the king's secretary, informing them of these remarkable births. King George could not believe it. He sent 2 men out to investigate, that of Nathaniel St. Andre, a Swiss surgeon to the king, and Samuel Molyneux, secretary to the Prince of Wales. But by now, Mary had become a local celebrity, and she had moved from Godalming to nearby Guildford, where she was closely monitored by Dr. Howard. By November 15th, Dr. St. Andre and Molyneux arrived to his home and were immediately greeted with the news that Mary was in labor with her 15th rabbit. She would go on to give birth to several more dead rabbits in their presence. The doctors conducted an examination on the lungs and internal organs of the little furry creatures, and they found that these rabbits most likely did not develop inside Mary's womb. Dr. St. Andre, on the other hand, was convinced the case was genuine. He believed them to be supernatural births, and even took specimens back to London to show the king, where the story quickly spread throughout London. The king then decided to send a German surgeon, Cyriacus Ahlers, and his friend, Mr. Brand, to investigate further, and again, the German doctor would witness Mary give several rabbit births. However, he was not convinced. He would take the rabbit parts back to London and found that several of the dung pellets in the rabbit contained corn, hay, and straw, meaning these rabbits had been raised by someone. Finally, Dr. Ahlers and Dr. Howard would report to the king that they suspected the whole thing was a hoax. Meanwhile, Sir Richard Manningham, another doctor and midwife among upper-class society in London, was contacted by St. Andre to attend. After observing her give birth to what he believed was a hog's bladder, he also seemed unconvinced, but he kept his doubts to himself until he could find proof. By now, though, the story was a national sensation, and interest in this brought people willing to pay to see it. And now, the Tofts saw a way to make money. Mary's story was that in April 1726, she had been working in a field when she was startled by a rabbit. She and another woman ran and tried to catch it, but failed. That night, she dreamed of a field with 2 rabbits in her lap, and she awakened with a sick fit, which lasted until that morning. From that time forward, she had a constant desire to eat rabbits, but being very poor, she could not afford them. And that's where the theory of maternal impression comes in, which is an old medical theory that has now been disproved, that suggested birth defects were caused by a powerful mental or sometimes physical influence working on the mother's mind, which would produce an impression on the child she was carrying. For example, it was often suggested that the elephant man's condition was brought on by the fact his mother had been frightened by an elephant during her pregnancy, thus imprinting the memory of that elephant onto the fetus. You can see why this was later dismissed, but you could also see where Mary had came up with this as an excuse. However, Mary would be brought back to London, where she was watched even more closely, and for 4 days, Mary produced no more rabbits, but continued to appear to go into labor. She was also badly infected and had fits that made her lose consciousness. Then, a carrier from a local brothel was busted trying to sneak a rabbit into Mary's room. He confessed then Mary's sister-in-law asked him to smuggle in the smallest rabbit he could find. The doctors were now satisfied, but Mary would still not confess. She was eventually taken into custody, where she still denied it. However, when a doctor threatened to perform a painful experimental surgery on her to see if she was formed differently, she then admitted the whole thing was a hoax. She admitted to have been inserting dead rabbits into her vagina and allowed them to be removed as if she had been given birth. In several different confessions, she implicated the wife of an organ grinder, her mother-in-law, Dr. John Howard, and a mysterious stranger who was not named. The medical profession would be mocked after this, especially St. Andre, the king's surgeon, who was duped and forced to post an ad to explain why he had fallen for it. However, he lost favor with the court, and his patients deserted him. He retired and died in poverty in an almshouse. Mary was dismissed of charges, most likely because it was deemed too embarrassing to pursue any further. She would spend a few months in jail and then faded into obscurity. She would be arrested 14 years later, though, for receiving stolen goods, but she was later acquitted and died a little over 2 decades later. However, she would be made fun of by several satirists of the day, and proving that sometimes the jokes write themselves. In that time period, the word used for a rabbit track was prick. No, I'm not making that up. So as you can see, writers had a field day with this whole saga. The name Rockefeller is one that's closely linked to wealth and power in America, with their fortune being made in the oil industry in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, starting the company Standard Oil, which would later become Exxon and Chevron, and later being closely linked to, or controlling, J.P. Morgan Chase Bank. They are long considered one of the most powerful families in American history, so it's not really a shock that many of the children that grew up in this family are able to pursue their passions without worry of cost. One of these was 23-year-old Michael Rockefeller, the son of New York Governor and later U.S. Vice President Nelson Rockefeller, who in 1961 went on an expedition for Harvard's Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Technology. Now this excursion was to Dutch New Guinea to study a tribe called Dani. It's here where a documentary would be filmed by Robert Gardner called Dead Birds, where Rockefeller would be the sound recordist. While there, Rockefeller would spend his time engaging and studying their culture. Letters back home spoke of his excitement in doing so, but that excitement would change on November 17th of that year, when Michael and Dutch anthropologist Renee Wassing would get on a 40-foot canoe and head out into the water. They were about 3 miles out when their pontoon became swamped and overturned. Their 2 local guides swam for help, but it was slow in coming. The men would continue to drift for a long time, well over a day, and they drifted further out. Now, they were about 14 miles away from shore, but Michael had enough and told Renee, "I think I can make it," and took off swimming to shore. Finally, the next day, Renee would be rescued, and he was stunned to find out that Michael had never made it back. It was quickly reported and reached the outside world, where the news quickly spread. Of course, there was a massive search to find him, which included helicopters, ships, and over 1,000 native canoes. People naturally assumed that in his attempt to swim to safety, he drowned or possibly died due to exhaustion or the elements, while some speculated he could have been attacked by a shark or saltwater crocodile. However, there was a far darker theory. Headhunting and cannibalism were still present in some areas of New Guinea in this time period. Some began to fear that maybe an exhausted Michael did make it to shore, only to be killed and eaten by the tribes from a village called Otsinep. Some even speculated that he had survived and was taken captive, or possibly had even began living with them and became somewhat of a demigod. Similar occurrences did happen in World War II, when Japanese soldiers fleeing the Asmat region were taken in by villagers and sometimes kept as prisoners or guests due to beliefs about their old appearance offering protection against forest demons. However, a journalist named Milt Macklin disputed these claims and would, 8 years later, go on to the island to do his own investigation. He found there was enough circumstantial evidence that showed Michael Rockefeller did not drown, but was instead killed, because unfortunately for Michael, some 3 years earlier, a Dutch patrol had killed several leaders of a village where it was thought Michael had came to shore. So this tribe, in trying to get revenge, would kill someone from the quote, white tribe. And since headhunting and cannibalism weren't just random, but instead a way to seek the ultimate revenge, it was thought it could have happened to Michael. However, Macklin would also state that he later on met with an Australian smuggler who claimed that Michael was alive and was living in a remote village. He stated he was half crippled with a sandy beard and identified himself as Michael Rockefeller and was part of the tribal council house. Michael told the smuggler he had made it by swimming to shore and was then captured by the villagers who believed he was an important sorcerer. The smuggler would go on to say he couldn't help Michael because he couldn't risk drawing attention to his illegal smuggling activities. This, of course, was never confirmed. Another author, Paul Toohey, would claim that Michael's mother hired a private investigator to go to New Guinea in 1979 to try and solve the mystery. He would later claim that he swapped a boat engine for the skulls of 3 men. These 3 men, according to the tribe, were the only 3 white men ever killed by them. The investigator would take the skulls back to the family, convinced that one of them was Michael. However, this story has been questioned, and the Rockefellers have never commented on it, although the History Channel did state Michael's mother did pay a $250,000 reward to the investigator, which had been offered for proof either way. Another update would come in 2014, when another author traveled to the island to investigate the disappearance. He was told several stories which had been passed down that again confirmed earlier tales that Michael had made it to shore only to be killed in revenge for the 1958 killings by Dutch authorities. Finally, in some grainy footage that was found for a documentary some 40 years later, purportedly showed Rockefeller rowing in a canoe with other tribesmen, and it's supposed to be proof that he lived out the rest of his life here. Of course, this is heavily disputed, and some claim this man was someone from a previous expedition. Easter Island, aka Rapa Nui, is an island way out in the southeastern Pacific Ocean that is mostly known for the nearly 1,000 huge stone statues called Moai, which were created by the early Rapa Nui people. Although it's unsure, the Polynesians are believed to have first inhabited the island either in 800 or 1200 AD, where they then built a thriving culture as evidenced by these enormous statues. It's believed these stone giants were built between 1250 and 1500 AD. Nearly half are placed at Rano Raraku, where the main quarry was, but hundreds of them were transported around the island's perimeter. They were all built to have overly large heads, looking more like living faces. The tallest one was over 33 feet high and weighed about 90 tons, while the heaviest one was about 95 tons, although one unfinished sculpture was found that, had it been completed, would have been 69 feet tall and weighed about 170 tons. They have heavy brows and elongated noses with a distinctive fish hook-shaped curl from the nostrils. The lips are thin and the ears are also elongated. The jaw lines stand out and the torsos are heavy, and on some of them, the collarbone is subtly outlined. The backs are usually not detailed, but sometimes they do bear a ring and girdle. They are on average about 13 feet tall and usually weigh around 13 tons. And contrary to popular belief, they are whole-body statues, not just the heads. It's just many of these statues have been buried up to their shoulders. But nearly everyone has heard of these Easter Island heads, as they're commonly known by. But the real mystery is, why were they built, and who were they supposed to be? Unsurprisingly, many archaeologists thought the statues were actually a type of container that stored the sacred spirit of the ancient Polynesian religions, and thus were symbols of authority and power, both religious and political. While some archaeologists believe the statues are a literal representation of their ancient ancestors, and that the statues face away from the ocean and towards the village as if they were there to watch over the people, except for 7 of these, which face out to the sea to help travelers. It's thought this was a way to honor deceased chieftains and important individuals, which is why each stone has unique characteristics. In 1981, 43-year-old Natalie Wood was working on her way to come back to Hollywood. The actress had begun her career as a child at the age of 8 and then transitioned into young adult roles. As a teen, She was nominated for Best Supporting Actress for her performance in Rebel Without a Cause, and would then be nominated for Best Actress for her performance in West Side Story. But during the 70s, she would take a break after having 2 daughters, one with her second husband, Richard Gregson, and one with her first husband, Robert Wagner, whom she remarried after her second divorce from Gregson. She appeared in only 2 films in the 70s and would pop up here and there on television shows, but it was now, in 1981, she was set to come back in a film called Brainstorm, which featured Christopher Walken, a man who needs no introduction. And it was on November 29th that during a break from production of the film, that Natalie and her husband, Robert Wagner, and Christopher Walken would all take a boat trip to Santa Catalina Island off the coast of California on Wagner's 50-foot-8 yacht, which was captained by a man named Dennis Stavron. And it's here that Natalie would tragically drown. However, the circumstances around her drowning are still mysterious, and many of the details around it are unknown. For example, how did she even enter the water? Her body was found around 8 a.m. the next morning, about 1 mile from the boat, and this is made more suspicious because Natalie vanished sometime around 11:05 p.m. when they all realized that the yacht's dinghy was missing. But it took almost 3 hours for someone at 1:30 a.m. to finally call the shore, and then the Coast Guard would be called 2 hours after this at 3:30 a.m., which is a very strange timeline. Around 8 a.m. was when Natalie's body was finally found. Then, the inflatable dinghy was found beached nearby. When questioned, Wagner would state Natalie was not with him when he went to bed, which was made stranger by the fact that Natalie was found with bruises on her body and arms, as well as an abrasion on her cheek, but no indication of how these injuries had occurred. The captain would tell detectives that Wagner and Natalie had argued that evening, which Wagner denied, although, in his memoirs later on, he would admit they indeed had been arguing before her disappearance. The autopsy also revealed that Natalie's blood alcohol content level was 0.14, and there was also traces of a motion sickness pill and painkiller which increase the effects of alcohol, although a witness from a restaurant later came forward and stated that they were all very drunk. Regardless, the coroner ruled her death as accidental drowning and hypothermia, speculating that her drinking led to her slipping while trying to reboard the dinghy. However, one thing against this was, Natalie was terrified of the water and had been her whole life, and people that knew her said there was no way she would have ever left the safety of a yacht on a dinghy. Further complicating the matter were witnesses who heard the woman screaming for help during the night. Other witnesses also reported hearing loud arguments between Natalie, Wagner, and Walken. But if we go back to the captain, Dennis Stavron, remember I said he came forward to state that Natalie and Wagner had been arguing? Well, he did, but not until 2011, which is a little late, but did lead to the case being reopened. He alleged that Natalie had been flirting with Christopher Walken, which enraged Wagner. He would also claim Wagner prevented the captain from turning on his searchlights or notifying authorities, and Davern plainly stated Wagner was responsible for her death. Natalie's death certificate was then changed from accidental drowning to drowning and other undetermined factors. Christopher Walken, however, was quickly dismissed as a suspect after this, and he's largely remained quiet about the whole affair, although he did state in a 1997 interview with Playboy that he thought the dinghy was smacking up against the yacht and keeping her awake, so she went to move it so she could get some sleep, only to fall in her drunken state, which seems consistent with the investigators' findings. Many people now believe, though, that Wagner murdered her, while others think he was trying to teach her a lesson since he knew she was scared of the water and inadvertently caused her death. And in 2018, the 88-year-old Wagner was officially named a person of interest. In southern Peru lies a group of geoglyphs made in the soil of the Nazca Desert known as the Nazca Lines. These mysterious lines were made between the years 500 BC and 500 AD. They were created by people making depressions in the desert floor, removing the pebbles, and leaving differently colored dirt exposed. Most lines run straight across the landscape, but there are some designs of animals and plants. They measure about 440 to 1,200 yards across. The combined length of the known lines so far is around 800 miles long and cover an area about 280 square miles. They are typically around 6 inches deep. The width of the lines vary considerably, but more than half are slightly more than 13 inches wide, while some are 6 feet wide. The lines are best seen from the air at around 1,600 feet, although they are visible from the surrounding foothills and other high places. Because it's so isolated and dry and windless, the lines have mostly been preserved. Hundreds of them are simple lines and shapes, but more than 70 are of animals, including a hummingbird, spider, fish, condor, heron, monkey, lizard, dog, cat, and a human. There's also trees and flowers. The first mention of them comes from 1553, when Pedro Cieza de Leon described in his book The Trail Markers. They didn't gain real prominence though until 1927, when Peruvian pilots started seeing them from higher up. And the mystery is, just what were they designed for? One of the most prevalent theories relates to its astronomy and cosmology. As was common in other cultures, the lines were intended to act like an observatory, maybe to point to the places on the distant horizon where the sun and celestial bodies rose or set at the solstices. This was typical of indigenous cultures, where many of them, like Cahokia, constructed similar earthworks. Another theory was that they were built as an irrigation system for their fields, or built to collect rainwater. There's also the religious theories, suggestions that they were built to appease their gods, and this one has some merit, because climate in this region is pretty dry, only receiving about 20 minutes of rain per year. It could be that this was a ritual to plead to their gods to send more water. And finally, how can you go without mentioning ancient aliens? Eric von Daniken believed the mysterious lines were used as landing sites for UFOs, and that they were made by aliens to help steer their spaceships. Between the years of 1946 and 1956, one of the most important discoveries in archaeology was made, one that held great historical, religious, and linguistic significance, because they include the oldest surviving manuscripts of entire books later included in the biblical canons, as well as some not considered canon. I'm of course talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were found in a series of 12 caves near the Dead Sea, actually only about 1.5 miles away from the Dead Sea. The scrolls were housed in jars, and although not all have been identified, they generally fall into 3 groups. About 40% of the copies of text are from Hebrew scriptures. 30% of the text were ultimately not canonized, like the Book of Enoch, while the rest are manuscripts of previously unknown documents that explore the rules and beliefs of certain groups within Judaism at the time. So with this being such a historical and religiously important find, archaeologists must know the origins of the scrolls, right? Well, no, although there are a few theories. The main one is that the scrolls were produced by a sect of Jews living nearby at Qumran called the Essenes. They were a group of mystics who flourished between the 2nd and 1st century BC. Actually, this was the most accepted theory until the 1990s. It's proposed that they were composed and hidden in the nearby caves during the Jewish revolt against the Roman Empire, sometime between 66 and 68 BC. There are some arguments that support this theory, such as finding 2 inkwells and plastered elements thought to be a table found during the excavation of Qumran, which showed evidence that some form of writing was done here. We also have Pliny the Elder's account, who described a group of Essenes living in a desert community near the Dead Sea at the time. Another theory is really just kind of a variation of the Essene theory that basically states that it was indeed a small sect that wrote all of these scrolls, but it wasn't the Essenes. Possibly, it was a group of priests called the Sadducees. Some take a different route altogether and insist the early Christians were the authors behind the text, using the fact that James the Just, Jesus' brother, and Paul the Apostle corresponds to some of the events recorded in these documents. Finally is the Jerusalem theory, which states the scrolls actually were the product of Jews who were living in Jerusalem and then hid the scrolls in the caves near Qumran while fleeing the Romans during the destruction of Jerusalem. Some postulate it could have came from the library of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, while some think they came from multiple libraries across Jerusalem. Proponents of this theory point to the diversity of thought and handwriting as evidence. Hey y'all, that does it for part 2 of the Historical Mysteries and Oddities Iceberg Explained. I hope you enjoyed. Goodbye and good night.